Hey everybody, my name's Josh from the channel Josh Richens Producer here on YouTube, but today I'm at Weiss Advice and I'm going to be talking about an editing technique that I'm going to show you in 3 levels of complexity. But this editing technique is also going to serve as a really good opportunity to talk about some philosophical points. Kind of like a Philosophical Friday mixed with a more general technique video. You know what? Run the intro.
Put on your sweats. No need to shave. Kick back and relax, because it's Philosophy Friday with
Josh Richens,
where we start off the weekend casual.
The technique in question is going to be faking a kick drum part, which I admit does bring up questions about the ethics of something like that, and so I do want to touch on that while I don't want it to be the entire focus of the video. Over time, the world of recording has been growing and developing, and we've been afforded new tools like virtual instruments and what we're going to be talking about today, things like editing. And that's changed the way that music not only sounds, but the way that it's made. For a lot of the music that I listen to and even make, these new tools and techniques are integral. But yet, some people still see things like editing as a sign of poor musicianship, and I want to dispel that myth immediately. The music that we're going to be working on today is by a death metal band made up of some of my very close friends, and the band is called Posthuman. Now, the drummer of this band is called Mark, and I want to show you some of Mark's drumming after the editing process. So here is a little bit of the drum tracks, and we can see already they're pretty heavily edited. Let's have a listen. Sounds awesome off rip, and you might think that it sounds awesome because of the editing, and while yes, I do think that that is a big part of it, otherwise I wouldn't have done the editing, it also sounds awesome because Mark is an incredible drummer. So the fact that I've edited this and that we've gone for a sound that is edited says nothing about his musicianships, and to prove it, I can play you a clip of one of their live shows. So pretty obviously an astounding drummer, if you ask me. I also want to take this moment to thank Mark for letting us do this video, because all of these techniques that I'm showing you, like editing and faking stuff, are used all the time in modern music production, especially in this genre, but it's kind of do and don't tell. And so it can be really hard to learn about this stuff because nobody wants to admit to it. So a big thank you to Mark, and I want to make it clear that because we're talking about editing something or faking parts, that does not mean we are talking about someone who's not a good drummer. Now, this also kind of begs the question, if Mark's such a good drummer, why did we choose to fake kicks? First of all, the guitarist of this band writes to a MIDI drum instrument that is already gridded as he's writing. So a lot of that stuff is going to dictate how he writes. Not only that, but this is a genre that's typically very gridded, if not entirely on the grid. We were kind of trying to play by the rules in that regard, while still maintaining groove in the drums where we could. But if you want to know more about that, make sure you check out my last video on this channel. I went more in depth on it there. Now, the specific issue that we had was that anytime we got to a big halftime section with rolling kicks underneath it, Mark was letting his feet kind of get away from him, and he was playing a little bit too fast, and we were starting to get groupings of like 5, and it was pushing out of time and coming back in time. To be honest, at tempos like this, your brain can't pull that stuff apart. It still actually sounds like nice rolling kicks underneath it, but we really wanted those kicks to lock onto the 16th, and we could have spent hours adjusting the kick pedals and letting Mark practice and do things like that because they are parts that he can play. But we didn't have the time to do all of that. And also, we had already set up and got all of the tones for drums. So that would have created a whole nother range of issues that we would have had to deal with. And so to keep the session moving, I suggested that we could play hands only for certain sections and then fake the kick drums underneath. Now, it's also important to point out that we're talking about a band who was going to use a MIDI drum part for their final product. And that's not uncommon in this genre at all. And so when it came to it, the fact that we could get their drummer on the track and that they were able to actually have live drums was huge for them. And so when it came to the question of, do we want to maintain our integrity and, keep the out of time kick part, or do we want to figure out what we can do to make this work and get the sound that we hear in our head onto this track? The answer was pretty obvious. At the end of the day, we're not trying to prove anything with this. We're trying to make music that we like and that we want to listen to. So, how are we going to fake these kick drums? Well, the way that I did it in the session was kind of quick and dirty. And I'm going to start off by showing you that because it got the tick of approval from the band. And that's a really good lesson. Being able to get a job done quickly and make everybody in the room happy and sign off on it is really important, even if you're not necessarily doing the best version of that job. So long as everybody is happy with the session and moving forward, knowing how to troubleshoot is really important. So before we get into it, let's have a listen to what we ended up with in the session. And that's this. It's pretty good. It's a little bit robotic if you ask me, and that's something that I'm going to address in the next two versions of this trick. But things sounded really good and everybody was really happy with it, and so it kept the session moving. Now, the way that we did this was pretty simple. It was, like I said, to get Mark to play hands only. So if I come in and I mute this kick punch section here, this is actually what the performance sounded like. Right? And then what we did was we got Mark to play a few kick drum sounds at a few different velocities. I honestly think I was being pretty quick and dirty with it, and so we only did 4. And as I say that, I'm scrolling through the project looking for them, but it seems I've cleaned up after the fact and deleted them. But what I did then was I took only the sound of my kick drum with all of my processing bypassed, and I set my kick track to 0 decibels, and I exported that sound so that I could pull it back into a MIDI instrument, and that MIDI instrument is sitting up here. This way I could write in a sound that was going to have the raw, no processing, kick drum mic only sound as a MIDI instrument, and it sounded like this. Then all I had to do was export that as audio and drag that audio, which was called Kick Punch 4 because I had done a few different tests before this, and put it in. Now, it's worth pointing out in here as well that while we were doing this, we did play around with our velocities, and I did copy and paste these velocities, and what it kind of did was created a repetitive roll. You don't hear this too much in the track, but if you wanted to be really meticulous with this, then I would go through and I would be a little bit more random with all of the velocities. But you can also see if we zoom in, they've kind of moved around a little bit. So I used a little bit of randomization to get them not entirely on the grid, just a tiny bit off. And I played around with the velocity just so it didn't sound too machine gun-like. Even still, it's a little bit robotic. After that, once I had bounced it, all I had to do was just drag it into the track and edit it in. So that's method number 1. Now, method number 2 came to me when I was editing some of the other 16th note sections that we didn't fake, because there are moments where he's playing 16th notes, but he's playing them in unison with things like a hammer blast, and so Mark was a little bit more intentional with the placement of his kicks. But like I said, it's these big open sections with rolling kick drums through like a half-time groove where his feet started to get away from him. Now, if you saw the last video, you would have seen me talking about editing hands and feet out of time from each other. And that gave me the idea. Why don't I just record Mark's feet? That sounded a bit weird. why don't I record Mark playing just his kick drum with rolling 16th note kicks, and then I could edit that together. And I can do the exact same thing that I did with the MIDI instrument, but I can do it with audio of Mark actually playing the kick drum. And so we should get rid of that robotic feel that I'm talking about. Now, I'm going to be honest, I haven't done this yet. So if you're seeing this, it went well. and if you're not, then maybe there's going to be another video down the line where we do talk about this once I've got it figured out. But I'm pretty confident this is going to work because of the way that we've done it all. So I recorded Mark playing some 16th note kicks, and they sound like this on their own. This is cut kind of halfway in between, so it doesn't start at a particular point, but nonetheless, it'll show you what it sounds like. So, as you can see, step one was to come in, cut all of the kicks individually right before the transient, and just move those transients in line so that we got a nice roll. But then what I did was I actually came through and I grabbed each of these sections, and you can see I've adjusted the volume in the clip gain to try and, one, get the kicks a little bit louder, because we were actually doing this with a real kick drum and not like a trigger or something like that, which is pretty common even in recording scenarios. So I wanted these kicks to be a little bit louder because when Mark's playing this fast, the volume does drop a little bit. And I wanted them to be a little bit more even. And so that sounds like this. Really awesome sounding, natural, rolling 16th note kicks. Now we just have to get them into our track, and that's where the next two versions of my technique come in. I think the first one's pretty obvious. It's just doing what we did with the MIDI instrument. Now, before I do that, another quick little tip is sometimes when you're doing things like this, where you're going to be maybe deleting certain parts and you've got something that everybody signed off on, just give yourself a safety save. What you can do is just save it as safety, whatever, and then go back, save back onto whatever project you're working in, do the job, and if anything goes wrong, you can always revert back to that save that you did just before you started with the maybe risky technique. And as you can see here, I've already done it a few times, so I'm just going to call this one Safety 3. And I'll come back over to Save As and just go back to my master project, which is the one that I'm working in. We'll say replace it so that it makes this the active project that we're working on. Cool, now that that's done, I can do the first method that I had of getting this in. And that was, like I've said probably a few times now, is to do what we did with our MIDI kick drum, but to do it with audio instead. So to do that, I'm just going to select all of this audio. I'm going to go Audio, Bounce Selection. I'm going to get it to replace that. We've got a nice chunk of kick drum right there, and I can drag this and just drop it in like that. Without even doing any crossfades, let's have a quick listen. Let's go back to the fake MIDI version. Now, to be honest, that sounds great. This new version with the natural kick has fixed everything that I was upset about with the unnatural robotic sound of the kick drum. So I'm super happy just going ahead with this. But Matt said something in the comment of one of my videos a while ago. It was actually another video about editing, and what Matt said in the comments was, I can't possibly think of how many times someone has asked me for secret settings or what makes the magic behind certain mixes. And the reality is usually just meticulous work. It's not glamorous, but that's what gets the job done. That's something that I think about a lot. A lot of times, doing a good job at something can just mean to not take shortcuts, to just do what it takes to get the result that you want, no matter what the workload is that comes with it. So this leads us to technique 3, and technique 3 is going to be the whole hog. Nothing gets left out because I want to do the best job possible of this. When I heard those rolling kicks with all of the mics going, I really like the sound of it. And so what I want is to have the sound of those kick drums in the overhead mics and in the room mics. Now, I could just put some tracks over the top of this and manage that myself, but these tracks are going to be sent off to someone else once I'm finished with them, and I don't want to be creating extra work for that person. I want to be sending them some clean drum tracks that just sound great, so they can drop them into their project and just get going. I don't want to create extra work. What I'm going to do is open up a notepad, and I'm just going to take note of some of the levels that I've got. For instance, my overheads are set to minus 1.8. My drums are set to minus 0.27. And that's just the bus that the overheads are going through. And not only that, but my stereo output, to give me a bit of extra headroom, is set to minus 10 decibels. Look, that might sound a little bit crazy. I did some wacky things on the gain staging in this, but trust me that I know what I'm doing. So I'm just going to write that down as well, which is master minus 10.6. Now, the reason we took those notes is so that we're going to be able to get back to the result that we had when we started the process. We can just go and punch the numbers back in and everything's going to be okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that if there's anything on my master bus, it's bypassed. I'm going to set that pre-gain back to 0. My drums are also going to get set to 0. I'm going to bypass everything on my drums. That includes going into saturation knob and turning it off with the activate effect button, which is just a funny glitch with like this old version of Cubase and saturation knob, is that it doesn't actually bypass when you hit the bypass button. And I'm also going to come over to my overheads track and I'm going to zero that out and I'm going to bypass all of my plugins there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bounce this section of audio as well. So audio, bounce selection, replace, and that's going to give me a nice thick block of audio to work with. And then I can come over here, add an audio track. We can call this KP for kick punch overhead. Now this is just going to be a placeholder for me. So I can do that. And I can grab these overheads and I'll just copy it this time. You can come back to the point that we want to punch. That's right here. And I will paste that in. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to unsolo everything and I'm just going to solo out this kick punch overhead and this overhead track here. And before I hit export on this, I might just bring up the audio so that we can kind of see the level. We'll put a tiny little fade on the end of this just so we can avoid any pops. And I might just pull the start of this out as well and also do a little fade. Now that that's done, I can bounce this out. Can make sure it's in the project audio folder. You can call it KP overhead bounce. So I'm going to make sure that this is coming back onto an audio track. I'm going to set my export range up so it's just a little bit wide of, you know what, it can be a lot wide because we can trim it down after the fact. So I'll set it to be a bar before and after the punch. And I'll hit export. We'll essentially glue our two overhead tracks together. So now that that's done, we're left over with this. very natural bleed for our kicks in the overheads. And now all I have to do is drag this guy here back up and maybe clean it up with some edits. Probably crossfade it there and crossfade it just here. And I can just delete everything else that was sitting underneath. Awesome stuff. Now that all of that's out of the way, I should be able to just hit crossfade on this. And if we come back and listen to our drums, this is the result. Now, I'm going to do the same thing with the room mics, and I'll include a snippet of that just after this. All in all, I'm pretty happy with how this has gone. You might be saying as well that this is kind of negligible. I could have just gone with option 2. You are completely right. I absolutely could have gone with option 2, but I wanted to do this the absolute best way possible that I could think of, despite the fact that it takes a little bit extra time. So yeah, I think this is a really good lesson for all of us to not be so lazy and to put the work in to get the results that we want. Anyway, that's all for this video. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And once you've done all of that, head over to wiseadvice.com. Matt has a whole bunch of amazing courses over there that you should definitely check out. Remember what we say here at Wise Advice. We are musicians. Sound is our instrument. Catch you next time.